Towards the end of last year, supporters of the channel voted on which aircraft types should receive priority when it came to planning videos for the start of this year. Now, I was really happy with the results, because the topic voted on was one that I've sorely neglected over the last couple of years, and that is observation and reconnaissance planes. Some of these aircraft are huge, advanced, long-range machines which are designed to fly deep over enemy territory. But on the other end of the spectrum, you also have a family of incredibly lightweight, simple aircraft, which are designed to operate more along the front lines of a modern battlefield. Well, when I say modern battlefield, I'm referring to the timeline that this channel mostly covers, which would be, 1920 to 1950-ish. One of the more famous of these light reconnaissance aircraft is the topic of today's video, and that is the Grasshopper. There is, however, one small problem. The Grasshopper was not one aircraft, but many, all emerging from the same requirements, all with similar designs, but each was unique and built by a different manufacturer. Now today we're going to be focusing on the three most famous examples of these aircraft. You had the Taylorcraft L-2, the Aeronca L-3, and the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, or Grasshoppers, I suppose. These are some of the most underappreciated aircraft from World War II. A lot of the work they did was inglamorous and thankless, but ultimately incredibly vital. Sadly, their importance is disproportionate to how little attention they receive today, so we're going to try and correct this. Hello and welcome. I am Christopher Rex Emerson, self-appointed custodian of far too many unbuilt airfix kits, and champion of moving office 3 times in 18 months. I wish I was joking. Logistical dramas aside, you're probably going to see a lot more of me in front of a camera in these videos moving forward. You do have my condolences. Now this is for 2 reasons. One, I want to be a bit more professional and appear on camera in a more professional manner because I actually take what I do quite seriously. And I want to also show YouTube and the audience in general, both newcomers and people in the future who have yet to find me, that I am indeed a human being and not some AI-generated faceless voice. As I've mentioned before, a lot of faceless AI-generated slop videos have been appearing on the platform over the past 18 to 24 months, and this has had a seriously negative impact on not only the history niche, but educational and informative niches in general. A lot of those videos that are being generated by generative AI systems are often factually incorrect, and this hurts the credibility of existing channels such as this one. Many of us take a lot of pride in what we do, and I definitely would not be spending hours upon hours upon hours every week doing research if this wasn't something I genuinely enjoyed doing and didn't have a lifelong passion for. And unfortunately, seeing as the platform of YouTube doesn't seem to be taking the initiative itself to tell its audience which channels are actually AI and which ones are made by people, I'm taking the initiative myself. That being said, I am going to ensure that most of the screen time of these videos is still going to be focused on the aircraft and other topics that I want to cover, and face camera time should only take up 5, maybe 10 or 15% at a stretch if it's occupying the entire screen, or if I'm planning to do some more lecture style videos, which are on the way, you'll just see a little picture-in-picture image of me in the corner somewhere. Hopefully it's a change you all like and don't mind. It's one that I've been wanting to do for a while, and unfortunately I have sort of had my hand forced as well. Anyway, let us move on from that sad discussion and actually talk about the Grasshopper light reconnaissance aircraft, starting with what led them to be developed in the first place. The United States Army has a long history with observation aircraft, dating back all the way to 1909 with the world's first military aircraft, the Wright Model B. In its earliest years, the observation aircraft's role was basic and simple. It was used to see the enemy at a distance further than what could be seen from the ground. From above, pilots could scout terrain, locate enemy formations, and relay information that would otherwise take hours or days to obtain. At a time when cavalry still performed most ground reconnaissance missions, and observation balloons were limited by their tethers, overt size, and distressing flammability, even primitive aircraft offered a decisive advantage. From this tentative beginning, the observation role became a permanent element of aerial doctrine. During the First World War, it expanded rapidly as aircraft proved indispensable for artillery spotting, battlefield reconnaissance, photographic mapping, and message delivery. Pilots and observers would develop systematic methods for directing artillery fire by radio and visual signals, which transformed gunnery from rough aerial bombardment into something almost approaching precision. By the end of the war, aerial observation had evolved from improvised scouting into a specialized discipline with dedicated squadrons, crews, equipment, and training. In the interwar years, the role continued to broaden as technology improved. As a result, during the 1920s and 30s, a steady stream of capable designs entered US Army service with remarkable regularity. Aircraft such as the Douglas O-31, the North American O-47, and the Curtiss O-52. However, though very capable, each new generation of observation planes tended to grow heavier and more complex. Designers pursued greater range, better radio equipment, stronger structures, and improved crew accommodation, but each improvement added weight and systems that had to be maintained. The O-47, for example, was a 3-seat all-metal machine with a loaded weight of nearly 3.5 tons, a concerning amount of bulk for an aircraft whose intended field of operation was, quite literally, a muddy field rather than a paved runway. Inevitably, such weight and complexity made maintenance more difficult and restricted where these aircraft could operate. This quickly led to complaints, as these so-called frontline observation aircraft often required facilities that frontlines rarely provided. Curiously, the solution to the Army's problem, or at the very least the inspiration for it, came from a foreign-built aircraft at an air race of all places. At the 1938 National Air Races in Cleveland, the German Luftwaffe, who were attending, were keen to demonstrate their new Liaison aircraft, the Fieseler Fi-156 Stork. It had excellent short field performance, and in modern terms is described as a short takeoff and landing, or STOL, aircraft. The 156 had an impressively short takeoff run of just 213 feet or 65 meters, and it could land in as little as 61 feet. US generals and other senior officers who observed the aircraft were sufficiently impressed that they quickly issued a specification of their own for a short takeoff and landing observation plane. This led to the development of the Stinson Aircraft Model 74, which would become the O-49 Vigilant in 1940. Now, the Vigilant and some other sister planes are a topic more for another day, but it served as a spiritual forerunner for the Grasshoppers. By the beginning of June 1941, the US Army wanted more of these lightweight but capable machines. The war in Europe had been raging for 2 years and showed no signs of letting up. Indeed, the Germans were currently amassing millions of troops along the Soviet border, and US relations with an increasingly belligerent Imperial Japan were rapidly deteriorating. Time was pressing, and so instead of seeking out a brand new design, a request was put out by the Army for existing light aircraft to be adapted and submitted to evaluations for military applications. This request soon led to the involvement of 3 manufacturers: Aeronca, Piper, and Taylorcraft. The first to answer was Taylorcraft, who responded with their model DC-65, which was a high-wing monoplane trainer with tandem seats. 4 prototypes were built and designated YO-57 by the military, and testing quickly began. These aircraft used a metal tube structure covered in fabric. They had a wingspan of 35 feet 5 inches, a length of 22 feet 9 inches, and stood approximately 6 feet 8 inches tall. The landing gear was fixed, and power came from a pre-production 65 horsepower Continental YO170-3 engine, which was a 4-cylinder horizontally opposed air-cooled unit. This drove a simple 2-blade wooden fixed-pitch propeller. Despite the engine's fairly small power output, this aircraft was incredibly light. It weighed 875 pounds empty and about 1,300 fully loaded. That low weight allowed for a top speed of 93 miles per hour and a range of approximately 230 miles, using just 18 gallons of fuel. Service ceiling was approximately 10,050 feet. Now, certainly, these stats aren't exactly exciting, and pale in comparison to almost all other military aircraft in service at the time, but this machine was exactly what the Army wanted. An initial contract followed for 20 production aircraft that were designated as the O-57. These were essentially the same as the prototypes, except they used a full production version of the Continental O-170 engines. A second contract quickly followed, and 50 more aircraft were placed on order. In 1942, the Army would abandon its O designation for observation aircraft. Instead, reflecting an ever-growing list of auxiliary roles, these machines were now given the L designation for liaison. As a result, the Taylorcraft O-57s were redesignated as the L-2-TA liaison aircraft, the TA suffix indicating Taylorcraft as the manufacturer. They would enter service in 1942, and along with other light observation planes of the time, they would be named the Grasshopper, which was a suitable name given the aircraft's ability to jump into the air from short, grassy fields. It wasn't long before Taylorcraft refined their design, and the first improved version was the L-2A. Externally, the most visible change was a reduced turtle deck, the fuselage section behind the wing and ahead of the tailplane, which greatly improved visibility. Inside, an SCR 585 radio was installed, and the observer's seat could rotate 180 degrees. A total of 336 were ordered, of which 140 were built by Taylorcraft, and the rest were outsourced to other manufacturers. These were followed by 490 L-2Bs, which were specialized for cooperation with the US Army Field Artillery units, and fitted with equipment such as aerial rangefinders. On top of these purpose-built military versions, 52 civilian models were pressed into military service as well. These would receive their own designations, from L2E through to L2L, depending on which Taylorcraft Model 65 they originally were. The final production version was the L2M. This model introduced a close-fitting engine cowling, added wing spoilers, standardized US Army Air Force instruments, and improved radio systems. 900 were built, bringing total L-2 production to around 1,800 aircraft by 1943. Now, there was a dramatic offshoot of the L-2, and that was the Taylorcraft Model ST-100, which would receive the military designation of TG-6. This was an unpowered training glider, with the engine and fuel systems completely removed. In order to balance the weight after the removal of the engine, the cockpit was extended forward by 2 feet 5 inches, with a large greenhouse to fit an instructor and 2 students. The vertical stabilizer was enlarged for better control, and the main landing gear was slightly shortened. Because the fuselage modifications preserved the center of mass, the wings required only one major change, which was the addition of upper and lower spoilers to improve low-speed handling. These gliders would normally be towed into the air by Stinson L-1Ds, which was the new designation of the old O-49 Vigilant, and they were used to evaluate new glider pilots' flying abilities and to train the pilots of the Waco CG-4 that would famously see service during the D-Day landings. 250 TG-6s would be produced, and 3 of them ended up in naval service for evaluation under the designation of XLNT-1. Moving on from Taylorcraft, the second company to supply a military version of a civilian light aircraft was the Aeronca Aircraft Company, which adapted its Model 65 TC Defender. For testing, this version received the designation YO58. In size, it was very similar to the Taylorcraft design, with a wingspan of 35 feet, a length of 21 feet 10 inches, and it was slightly taller at 9 feet 1 inch. Construction used a combination of aluminium and steel tubing, along with wooden structural elements, all covered in fabric. Power came from the same 65 horsepower Continental engine used in the O57. Although slightly lighter than the Taylorcraft, at 835 pounds empty and 1,260 pounds at maximum weight, it was also slightly slower, with a top speed of approximately 85 miles per hour. Range was still 230 miles, and service ceiling reached 10,400 feet. Like its counterpart, the YO58 carried a crew of 2. The aircraft itself was unarmed, but each crewman was carrying a .45 caliber Colt M1911 pistol and sometimes either a .45 caliber M3 submachine gun or a .30 caliber M1 carbine. The type was quickly accepted for military service, followed by an order for 50 production aircraft as the O58. As before, the main difference between the prototype and production aircraft was the switch to full production Continental engines. The aft cabin side windows were also changed from trapezoidal to oval, and soon afterwards the Army adopted its new Liaison category, and these aircraft, like the ones by Taylorcraft, was redesignated, receiving the designation of L-3. Most L-3s served within the United States as training aircraft. The first updated version appeared in 1942 as the L-3A. This model had a slightly widened fuselage and revised window arrangement, which increased maximum weight by about 90 pounds. 20 would be built. It was then followed by the L-3B, which introduced a modified glazed enclosure and additional radio equipment. Despite the extra weight, the redesigned fuselage produced a slight speed boost owing to better streamlining, which raised the maximum speed to 88 miles per hour, and a total of 335 L-3Bs would be eventually built. The most numerous variant would be the L-3C. Essentially, it was an L-3B with its radio equipment removed, and it was used mainly for basic flight training during the war. 490 were built by 1943, with 3 examples serving within the US Navy under the designation of JR-1. Altogether, production of the L-3 series reached approximately 899 aircraft. A small number saw service in the Pacific, but most were employed domestically as trainers. On top of this, 48 civilian models would be pressed into military service, mostly for training duties, and they would receive military designations of L3D through to J, depending on the version of the Aeronca Model 65 they were being converted from. Like Taylorcraft, Aeronca would also deliver a glider trainer version of the L3, with its engine and fuel systems removed, and replaced with a larger canopy capable of fitting 3 crew members. These would be designated the TG5, and would see larger vertical stabilizers and a redesigned landing gear. 250 of these would be built, and were mostly used for glider pilot training and evaluation. The final company to submit a civilian aircraft for military conversion was the Piper Aircraft Company. The company provided 8 of the J3C-65 Cups. These were given the military designation of YO59. Like the others, they were high-wing monoplanes with a fixed landing gear. Their structure used steel and aluminium framing with wooden wing spars, all covered in dope fabric, and like the other aircraft, they were powered by the same 65 horsepower Continental engine. In both size and performance, the Cub closely matched the Taylorcraft and Aeronca designs. It had a wingspan of 35 feet 2 inches, a length of 22 feet 4 inches, and a height of 6 feet 8 inches. Its empty weight was 740 pounds, with a maximum weight of 1,220 pounds. It had a top speed of approximately 87 miles per hour, a service ceiling of 11,500 feet, and a shorter range compared to its contemporaries of 260 miles. These would enter service with the initial designation of 059, with a fairly large first production order of 140 examples being placed. These differed little from the prototype other than the addition of a 6-volt electrical system and slightly improved radios. In April 1942, these would be redesignated, being given the designation L-4. 4 examples of the aircraft were supplied to the United Kingdom for testing, and they would be renamed once again, being given the designation of Cub Mark I. These early production models were soon followed by the widely produced L-4A. These had increased visibility for the observer, who also received the benefit of a rotatable seat. A total of 948 of these would be delivered, and they would be the first L-4s to see combat. They would take off from the USS Ranger on the 9th of November 1942 during the Allied invasion of North Africa during Operation Torch, where they would provide spotting for the naval shore bombardments. Other L-4As would remain in the continental United States as training aircraft, and several others would be used for liaison duties. The L-4Bs were similar in appearance, but they had their electrical and radio systems removed, which was a bit of a curious decision, as these would serve with the US Army Field Artillery units. 980 of these would be produced, and it seems most of them without the radios. Operating from forward airfields, they soon encountered problems, both with dust clogging their carburetors, which forced the installation of new air filters, and a lack of easy communication with the ground, owing to, the lack of a radio. Some of these aircraft would have the SCR 610 radio installed to give them some ability to communicate with the ground, but it's unclear on the exact number. A single example of the L-4B would also find itself in RAF service, and a total of 107 civilian Cubs were pressed into military service and would be designated as the L-4C through to the L-4G. The most widely produced version of the L-4, and indeed the most widely produced Grasshopper of all, was the L-4H, of which 1,801 models would be delivered. These were very similar to the L-4B, completed without electrical or radio equipment, but with an improved single-piece windshield and an upgraded braking system for the undercarriage. They were followed by 1,680 L-4Js. These were intended to use variable pitch Beech Roby propellers to improve their takeoff performance, but the propellers proved unreliable and were eventually replaced with fixed pitch propellers made of wood, making them effectively identical to the L-4H. Altogether, L-4 production would reach approximately 5,553 aircraft. Now, although the Navy showed little, if not just tentative interest in the L-2 and the L-3, the L-4 did catch their attention, and they were ordered by the Navy in large numbers. These would be designated as the NE-1 training aircraft. 230 of them would be ordered, and they would feature dual controls. 20 NE-2s would then be ordered. Now, these were broadly identical to the NE-1, but these ones had variable pitch propellers that seemed to actually work. A major redesign then appeared as the HE-1, which was an ambulance version. This variant had a modified turtle deck that hinged upwards so that a stretcher could be loaded into the rear fuselage for medical evacs. In 1943, the Navy redesignated it as the AE-1, deciding that the letter A was a more logical prefix for ambulance rather than H, which I'm assuming was meant to be used for hospital. Because of the added weight of taking on a medical casualty, the engine for this aircraft was upgraded, with the Continental aircraft engine being replaced by a 100 horsepower Lycoming O235, which itself was another 4-cylinder air-cooled horizontally opposed unit. Just as with the other two manufacturers, Piper also produced a training glider variant. This would be designated as the TG-8 and would be a simpler conversion than the others, with the engine and fuel systems removed, and a cockpit extension with controls was just simply bolted onto the old engine mount. The new front section allowed a third crewman and also contained a hinged canopy for entry. Spoilers were added to the upper wing and the landing gear was slightly modified, and approximately 250 of these were purchased by the US Army Air Force Training Command, and 3 more by the Navy, being designated as the XLNT-1. As they were produced in the most numbers, the L-4s would understandably see the most service. Quite famously, the L-4 would take part in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in June 1943, where they were launched from the US Navy landing ships tank, or LSTs, that were fitted with special pierced steel planking which were used as improvised flight decks. These were one-way trips, however, as the landing ships, cosplaying as aircraft carriers, lacked any sort of aircraft recovery equipment. A slightly better solution was to modify the L-4 with nose hooks for use with LSTs that were equipped with the new Brody cable system, which was a 300-foot cable strung between towers that could both launch aircraft and allow them to land with a fancy catch system. These would be first used in Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945. Now, it's actually a very interesting system, and if you want to learn a bit more about this, I made a video about the Brody cable system a couple of years ago, so feel free to check that out afterwards. Although, like the others, the L-4 carried no fixed armament beyond crew weaponry, this did not stop inventive, or perhaps bored, ground crews from improvising. And oh boy, did they improvise! Some of them strapped M1 or M9 60mm bazookas to the wing struts in a rather extreme field modification for an observation plane. Others were given bomb shackles and armed with droppable hand grenades. Supposedly, one L-4 was even credited with destroying a few German tanks following the Allied invasions at Normandy. With such a wide range of uses, which now included ground attack of all things, the little Liaison aircraft earned itself another nickname, which was Maytag Messerschmitt, which was a tongue-in-cheek reference to the American appliance manufacturer. The versatile and sometimes bazooka-armed L-4 would continue to serve after the war, and even took part in the Korean War in the early 1950s, until it was finally replaced by the Cessna L-19 Bird Dog, another aircraft which developed a proclivity for having various recoilless weapons strapped onto its wings. Very much like the Wiley Jeep, it's hard to overstate the general importance of the Grasshoppers in the Second World War. Between providing basic pilot training, transporting officers around the front lines, spotting for artillery, providing medical evacuations, and a whole string of other often thankless roles, they were the silent workhorse of the US Army Air Force in the Second World War. Now, the role of an ultralight aircraft capable of landing on rough airstrips with minimal landing space was something that never really went away. But it was one that would soon be filled by an entirely new type of flying machine, and that was the helicopter. A lot of people have been asking for videos on helicopters, and they are most certainly on the way. But that will be a story for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. Over the next several videos, I will probably tweak and adjust the studio setup as I adjust to being on camera a bit more, but on the whole I am happy with how things have turned out so far. Now, some videos will have more camera time than others, of course, but I'm going to try to not let it overtake my core editing style, so fear not. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Kent Jackson and Joe Garber, who are the newest members of this special group. Now, hopefully there will be a deep dive video coming out quite soon, and one on a highly anticipated topic at that, so I'm hoping that will come as something of a consolation for the slow start to this year. Some other videos are also in the works too, so you'll have some regular viewing material again in the not too distant future. But that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support and patience after having had me promise to do regular videos at the start of the year and have that immediately fall by the wayside due to extenuating circumstances, but we'll gloss over that. And I shall catch you all next time. Goodbye.